This episode of Scandal Water contains adult themes and descriptions of violence. It is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
And Ashley
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1. Stories and scandal water, it's where you need to be. Stories and scandal water, let's pour you a cup of tea.
Happy season 3, Ashley.
Happy season 3. We are here, sister.
Isn't this amazing?
It is amazing.
Starting our 3rd season. What would this be? Our 101st episode, I guess?
Yes, I believe it is.
I love it.
Mm-hmm.
This is so fun. And we are starting out on such a high note because we are coming in hot. With these debut episodes are going to be so interesting. You know, I like to start by asking a little question or
Yes,
something.
you do. Mm-hmm.
So here's what I will ask you. Everybody knows, I think, by this time that we do have just a tiny interest in true crime.
Right.
And I also know that we've discussed before, I know you're familiar with the podcast, Your Own Backyard by Chris Lambert, but have you ever had a chance to actually listen to that?
No, I have not. But I remember seeing a episode, I'm going to call it Dateline. I don't know it was Dateline, but he was the one that helped to find, I think you even talked about it in one of our episodes, right? What was her name? Smart?
Kristen Smart.
Kristen Smart. He helped to find her.
He absolutely did.
Or to find her killer.
Well, he helped to get the case resolved.
Get it resolved.
100%. Yeah, he was a fella who started this podcast, again, called Your Own Backyard, because he shared in some different interviews what motivated him was that it was basically in his backyard. As he would travel around his city, different places, he would pass this billboard that had the smiling face of this beautiful young woman. She was a college student who had disappeared from Cal Poly in 1996. And he shared that he saw it, fading over the years, but it was still there. And it registered with him one day. Whatever happened to this woman? Did anybody ever discover? Did anybody ever find her? And this led him to the idea of investigating on his own. It was not his field.
Right.
In fact, I believe he has a music background. But because of his work, researching, digging into it, people started coming forward because he was opening new lines of communication, putting it in front of the public again. And he started that in 2019. And in 2023, Paul Flores was convicted for Kristen's murder.
Just think about that. What if he had never picked up the microphone and decided to do this?
I know, absolutely. Such a powerful story. Well, that is something that kind of spoke to Ashley and myself. Now, obviously, we are not going to be able to create a documentary or solve any cold cases.
No.
But we were fascinated by the idea of looking at things that are right there in front of you. Interesting cases that are in our own backyard, so to speak, which for us is Kentucky.
Right.
So we decided that our theme as we open season 3 would be in our own backyard. And we are going to kick off this new season with a 2-episode feature on a fascinating case that occurred in towns not too far away from us back in 1936. And this case has more twists and turns than a curly fry.
Or a dark highway.
There you go. Or a dark highway. That, in fact, is the basis for this. Ashley, you're the one who found the book Dark Highway. Do you want to share quickly how that came about?
Oh, yes. I had heard about it, I think, shortly after it was published in 2016, 2017, around in there. And the author, Anne D'Angelo, came to a local library and was giving a talk. And I went and saw her talk. And I don't remember if I bought the book there, but I know that she autographed it for me. But, it's been 5 or 6 years since then. So I've lost lost a lot of the information. I know the basics of the case, but it was a fascinating story. Fascinating because also it was so close to home.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, 100%. In fact, I will say, as I've now read it, and that was something that struck me, is there were names I recognized, obviously locations I recognized. It does feel like in our own backyard to me. And her book is incredibly well written and well researched. One of the things that we discovered when you read it, she tells you in the opening, she spent something like 6 years researching this book.
You can really tell.
Ashley and I decided, you know, she's a person who lives within the state of Kentucky. She's not too far away. So we contacted her, and Anne D'Angelo has agreed to do an interview with us.
I know, that's exciting.
We are beyond excited. So what's going to happen, guys, is in this first episode, we're going to lay the foundation. We're simply going to tell you what occurred in this very fascinating case. And then we're going to come back, and next week, you are going to get to hear us talk to Anne D'Angelo. She's going to talk to us about the research process and getting to speak to descendants of people who were involved in this case. And of course, we are going to get to ask her a lot of her insights, her theories, and some of that behind the scene information that is so fascinating.
Yes. So I'm going to play the part of the audience today because it has been so long since I have read the book, and we've purposely had me not reread it before this episode so that I could be the audience, and you are going to play the part of the narrator as you do so well. And then by the time we talk to Anne, I will have read the book and be a little bit more informed.
Yes. And I can't wait. This
Reread
is
the
such
book, I should say.
Yeah, such a fascinating story. It really is. So, as Anne does in her book, I'm going to start with the event that started everything, and then we'll kind of go back.
The catalyst.
Yes. So, on the evening of November 6th, 1936, a beautiful woman named Verna Garr Taylor lay dead in the ditch off Highway 22 near a farm owned by George and Nettie Baker. A single bullet hole pierced her dress over her left breast. She was wearing one shoe, while the other shoe was positioned between her outstretched arm and body. In her left hand, she clasped a glove. The other glove was in the mud beside her feet. A large army pistol lay about 4 feet away on the side of the embankment. The man who had spent that entire day with her, her fiance, Henry Denhardt, told everyone immediately it was a case of suicide. To the people who would soon start investigating Verna's death, it looked like murder.
Right. The first thing you would think is, okay, the gun is laying 4 feet away. Unless there was a big recoil, how would it get 4 feet away from her? She's holding a glove in one hand. So how could you hold a heavy army pistol with one hand to shoot yourself? And why did one shoe come off? That's just immediately what I would think.
Yes, absolutely. Those are some of the questions that they were asking as well. So now we'll back it up. Let's talk about these two people. Anne, in her book, referred to both of them as, quote, remarkable but yet unusual.
Okay.
All right. Verna Garr Taylor was a 40-year-old widow who was raising 2 daughters on her own. She had married her childhood sweetheart, but he had died from complications due to acute appendicitis back in 1931, which left her alone to support her 2 kids, her 2 daughters, and to run their business, which was the community laundry in LaGrange, Kentucky. And this was during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
This woman did this job so well that when she died, she not only had no debt, she actually had something like $3,500 in her bank account.
That's amazing.
And she had just that day purchased some things for the upkeep of the building. This woman was accomplished.
Which also goes against suicide, because why would you buy stuff to better your business if you were getting ready to kill yourself?
Great question. She was not only described as being a smart businesswoman, as we've just alluded, everybody called her friendly and likable. She was a valued member of the community who attended LaGrange Methodist Church, and she'd even taught Sunday school there for quite some time. And they described her as being very attractive. After her death, the press would often refer to her as the most beautiful woman in Oldham County, or sometimes they would say the most beautiful woman in 2 counties, referring to Oldham and Henry.
Okay.
So that's Verna.
Okay.
Now, Henry Denhardt, on the other hand, was 60 years old, so he was 20 years older, and he had a long, very impressive career in law and politics. At different times in his life, he was an attorney, a judge, a military man and a war hero, a state lieutenant governor, he won that in 1923, an adjutant general, and twice he even ran for governor. He did not win. But this was a man who had...
He had a high position,
Yes,
lots of high positions, lots of power.
Lots of power, lots of status. And some wealth. He also had some great accomplishments to his name. I'm not going to list them all, but one of them was that he was instrumental in creating Kentucky's Highway Patrol.
Oh.
Yeah. And he also pushed for Mammoth Cave to become a national park.
Well, that's cool.
He did some great things. Now, on the flip side, Henry Denhardt, who was sometimes referred to as General Denhardt or just the General, also had some controversy surrounding him.
Yeah.
He had handled a couple of different situations that really hurt his reputation and made him some enemies. One of those, for example, he was accused of mishandling the Floyd Collins case where that man was trapped in the cave, and that got him some criticism. And then just a year before this incident with Verna's death, back in 1935, he had made a huge blunder when he led more than 700 National Guardsmen into Harlan County to address an alleged voting fraud scheme. He had ended up being indicted on the charge of criminal contempt, and a warrant was issued for his arrest, but rather than turn himself in, he went on the run for a few days before he surrendered, but managed to get the governor, who was Governor LaFoon, to pardon him before the trial. So he got off and basically he was pardoned. He was said to be fine, but it looked bad.
Yeah, it does.
And
that's bad PR.
yes, absolutely. And Anne speculated in the book that this was probably a factor that
Why he didn't get governor?
Well, actually, that led to him kind of stepping back from politics and retiring to Oldham County because that was 1935. And remember, this incident with Verna happens in 1936.
Gotcha.
So at the time that he and Verna meet, he is single. He and his wife divorced in 1932. Speculation being that it was probably due to infidelities and heavy drinking. This was a heavy drinker. So when he crossed paths with beautiful, intelligent businesswoman Verna Garr Taylor, not surprising that she would catch his eye.
Right.
So how they met was Henry was on this farm, had 800 acres, and his sister Bertha actually lived there with him. She was older by 5 years and she was single. And so she kind of took it upon herself to run his household for him because he was an important man.
Sure.
And she didn't have her own family.
Didn't have anything else to do.
Right. But she found it a little bit isolated.
Okay.
Out there on that farm with just kind of the two
800
of them.
acres is pretty
Yeah.
isolating.
So I think because she was, a little lonely out there, Henry briefly considered the idea of renting a home closer to town. Now, Verna's mom owned a place that was for rent.
Okay.
So Henry contacts Verna about this home. He ends up ultimately declining. He decides, no, he's not going to do that. But when he calls Verna to decline, he makes some small talk with her. And he asks how she's doing. And she mentions, she's doing fine, just a little bit lonely. And he says he's lonely too. And they decide that two lonely people might want to hang out together. That was his suggestion. So she tells him he's welcome to come sit on the porch with her. And that basically ends up being their first date.
Okay.
It occurred on June 13th of 1936.
So in June is the first date, and then this tragedy happens in November.
It is fast.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And in fact, it's going to get faster because listen to this. The two basically became a couple. They were very interested in each other. But the first month or so, they spent very little time in person together because she had this trip planned and it was long. So she's gone on that trip. And then about the time she's coming back, he has 2 weeks of military maneuvers to go to. So most of their communication there in the beginning was through letters or phone calls. And in fact, this is another thing I love about this book. It is so engaging. But Anne manages to find so many documents. And one of the things that she finds are some of these letters that Verna had written to the general. And so she got to have a firsthand look into
At how she was talking to him. Was she really
Yes.
interested in him?
Right, how she sounded, what kind of personality she had. So it really was fascinating. I highly recommend you guys read this book. But the point is, a lot of their communication was through these kind of distant methods. Now, Henry would later claim that he proposed to Verna and gave her an engagement ring in late August. Okay, that's a couple months
2
later.
months.
2 months.
That's fast.
The family would dispute that she actually accepted his proposal.
Okay.
There never was a public announcement of their engagement. She did have an engagement ring, though, and she had shown it to some people. Some of her friends had seen it, but rather than wear it, she usually kept it in a hanky tucked in the front of her dress somehow.
Now, that could be because she works in the laundry. She doesn't want to get it messed up. Or if it's very expensive, she could be protecting it because she doesn't want to get it stolen or get robbed or, something like that.
Yeah, but it's a little unusual.
It is unusual.
Yeah. The other thing is, the more Henry came around, it seemed like the less Verna's daughters and brothers seemed to like him.
Yeah.
By the way, Verna had 2 sisters and 3 brothers. The sisters don't really play a role in the story, but these 3 brothers are going to
do.
play a large large role. Okay, you'll be hearing more about them later. But later testimony from the two daughters and the housekeeper, Bertie Bennett, would tell of some arguments that went on between the couple, overhearing a time that Verna asked Henry to leave, and even a threat that Henry made against Verna's brother Roy, which Bertie Bennett, the housekeeper, heard, and she even went and told Roy because she was concerned.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Henry looks real good on paper, but in person, he's kind of a mess.
I'm going to say, as a reader, I was not a Henry fan.
Yeah.
So on the fateful day of November 6, 1936, Verna and Henry were scheduled to take a day trip to Louisville and back. Not only because they were going to have this, time together, but also they had so many things packed into this day. I don't know if this was like a thing back then where it was a really special deal. If you were going to take a day trip, you were just going to like schedule everything.
Probably because it was so far away. I tend to do that. Living further out, you do tend to schedule, okay, I'm going to go into town and I'm going to get everything done on this day because it's such a hassle to drive such a far distance back and forth.
Well, that makes sense. And I've done that too, but boy, did these people have a lot planned. But they were going to go back and forth for the social time, also so Vernon could take care of some business. And what was interesting, though, was the night before, which, by the way, there had been a little bit of bad weather, okay? But the driver for Verna's laundromat was this handsome younger man named Chester Wolfick. And through working for their family, through their laundromat, and also sometimes, having to drop by the house to drop things off from the laundromat, Chester had become a family friend. At one point, he even gave music lessons to one of the daughters. So the night before, as Henry's driving, I'm assuming, towards home, he happens to pass Verna in the vehicle with Chester, and Henry stops. They stop their cars to speak. Now, not sure if this is what, instigated the fact that he ended up renting a hotel room and staying in LaGrange that night rather than go to his home that was only 5 miles away. But it seemed odd. It was something that
Now,
Anne
did she
pointed
ride in
out.
the car with him a lot, or was this unusual?
I think sometimes she would because of their laundromat, their laundry business,
Okay.
maybe.
So there was
dropping-
nothing untoward.
No, but that is something that's going to come up.
Okay.
Questions of whether there was more to their relationship.
Okay. Because you said he's about 20 and she's 40?
He was younger, to be honest. I don't remember
Okay.
exactly how much younger, but it's a significant bit.
Okay, because I'm thinking he might have been interested in one of her daughters.
No, I think he's older than 20.
Oh, okay.
So Henry said that the reason he ended up staying in town was because the weather was bad. But Anne does note in her book, Dark Highway, that this is a frugal guy, and it does make you wonder.
I bet he just wanted to keep an eye on her.
Right. Was this jealousy? Was it, what's the deal? And, if the weather was that bad, then why did they still go on the trip the next day?
Right.
Right. But anyway, the next morning, November 6th, Verna and Henry leave for their day trip. And she did wear her engagement ring. A large number of people, including, her daughters, family members, friends, would end up interacting with Verna on that day, whether it was before she left or during the course of the day. And all of them would later say that she seemed cheerful and friendly. After Verna's death, the investigators would have to go back and try to retrace their movements for the entire day, which proved pretty frustrating because they did a lot. And they ended up with a couple of things that were really confusing, hard to explain. And they also found at least one really large gap. So I'm going to talk you through their day and let you make of it what you will.
All right.
Remember, read the book because it's so good and it's so detailed. I'm giving you this little abbreviated version.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm tried really hard to be accurate, but forgive me if I mess up any details.
We forgive you everything.
Thank you. So at some point, Verna picked up an item from a friend that she was going to return for her while she was on her trip. That woman later did receive credit, indicating that Verna had accomplished that task.
Okay.
So we know that. At some point that morning, the couple had a flat tire that was addressed. Verna was supposed to have a bridge luncheon with her cousin Bess Lee, but Henry ended up calling for Verna to beg off, saying that she had a headache. And on the phone, he also mentioned a few different times that he felt sick. This was a thing that came up, that he felt sick. He didn't feel good. Okay. The two had some lunch together, and I'm pretty sure I recall it might have been at the Seelbach Hotel in their dining room.
Okay.
Okay. Then in the early afternoon, Verna separated to go take care of some business, and at least one of those was a big meeting related to some business with her laundromat.
Okay.
During the time they were separated, Henry would later testify that he went to get a shave at a nearby hotel, then hung out in the Pendennis Club for a while. That was around 2:30 to 3. Then went back to the Seelbach to talk to some friends, and then to the Kentucky Hotel. Here's one of the points of confusion, and we never really get this cleared up, by the way. Around 4 p.m., Henry rented a room at the Kentucky Hotel in downtown Louisville, but for less than an hour.
Did he need a nap?
Don't know.
Or did he have a dalliance?
Don't know.
Okay.
And it's interesting. I'm going to jump ahead. They never asked him about this at the trial.
Why not?
I think because they were afraid he might say something disparaging about Verna, that it might give him
Oh.
an opening to insinuate
that maybe they had a dalliance?
something going on.
I see.
However, a family friend of Verna's, who would actually end up being an attorney on the prosecution team against Henry at the trial, his name was Ballard Clark, happened to pass Verna and chat with her on that day around 4:15 to 4:30
So she wasn't in the
p.m.
room.
Doesn't seem likely she was in that room with him if she was passing this guy at that time.
Okay.
But this is just such a confusing point because Anne mentions again, why would a frugal man like this rent a hotel room for only a very short time in the middle of a day trip? You know, it's...
Yeah, it seems odd.
So that's going to come up quite a bit. The other thing that she brings up is, why would a man who had said he was so sick be doing all this visiting and socializing and walking around during this time period?
Spreading his germs. He's giving a gift to everybody.
So lots of confusion there.
Right.
Now, they were seen together in another restaurant later for dinner. I did not record the exact time they arrived, but I did note in my notes that they left the restaurant around 6:30 p.m. During this time that they were having dinner, they were overheard, I believe it was by the server, if I recall correctly, calling to bow out of a commitment. They were supposed to chaperone at the dance of one of Verna's daughters that night.
All right.
But the excuse was her headache. And then other than that, the person observing them said, seemed okay. There were some quiet moments as they were eating their food, but nothing that really stood out as being overly concerning.
Okay.
Now, one other thing that happened was Henry did do some drinking. He would testify later that he had purchased some alcohol while he was on the day trip. And he said that Verna was fine with this, that she seemed to understand that he wasn't feeling well and he had a reason to be upset. So she was okay with him getting some liquor, but she was a teetotaler.
Yeah.
So wondering
Probably
about that. And he did have a glass. He borrowed a glass while he was having his dinner to drink some. And Verna, after this, was seen driving their car.
Oh, so he was probably too intoxicated to drive.
It's a possibility. Could have been the drinking, could have been that he was sick, who knows, but she was seen
But
driving.
she had a headache, so she's also not feeling good.
Right. And last little note here before we get to kind of the big moment, the tragedy. They left the restaurant around 6:30, which is significant because the next person to see Verna was Barney Browning at his service station, which was around 8:45 to 9 p.m. So there's one of those big
Big
gaps.
gap. That's a big gap.
Yeah.
3 hours is a lot.
And they don't know what happened. Yeah. I guess it was maybe more like 2, but still, it's unaccounted for time. All right, this leads us into the tragedy. So what happened was, Barney Browning would later testify that Verna showed up at his service station just before closing time, saying that their car was stalled. They had left it over at the nearby schoolhouse. And so they pushed the car to the service station where he was going to try to see if he could fix it. While they're pushing, Henry is sitting in the car beside Verna, who is steering. And Barney Browning actually asked, why isn't he helping? And the answer was, he's sick. Okay. Now they tried some things, couldn't get it to start. So they tried the strategy of pushing the car down you push it down a hill to see if you can kind of jump start it, get it going. But it stopped again in the middle of the road. And Verna ends up flagging down a car driven by a man named J.B. Hundley. Mr. Browning, he's kind of out of it now. He goes back to his service station. They were closing up.
Okay.
So now she's here with this man, J.B. Hundley, and another guy who lived nearby named George Baker. He's the one who owns the farm. He also stopped to see what's going on, see if he could help.
Okay.
The service station's closed. I think they decided it was probably a battery issue. So with it being so late, they didn't want to leave the car in the middle of the road. George Baker suggested they push the car to his nearby driveway and then use J.B. Hundley's car to run over to LaGrange to get a battery.
Okay.
George actually kind of goes off into his house thinking that all 3 of them had left to go get the battery, but Hundley later testified that he asked the couple if they wanted to ride along, and someone said, no, we'll just wait. But because of the car was noisy, he couldn't tell if it was a male or female voice.
Well, you just asked this guy to get a battery for you and you didn't go with him
Isn't
to
that
get the
odd?
battery?
I thought the same thing.
Yeah, like, hey, I don't know you. We just flagged you down. Would you go run and get a battery for us and come right back? Do you want to go with me? Nah, you just do it by yourself.
I thought that was kind of odd, too.
That is really weird.
Yeah. So George's dog starts barking, which makes him look outside, and he sees Henry Denhardt walking by really quickly, and Henry looks over and sees him, and he asks if he has a phone. Now, this is a little odd odd because at some point when they'd been together, somebody had already asked George if he had a phone, and he had said he didn't have one. So it was
like in his house, not a cell phone.
Right,
For us,
right,
we'd go,
yes.
you got a cell phone I can use? He meant in his home.
In his house, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, why is he asking me that again? But he saw Henry go back to his car, and then about 10 or 15 minutes later, he noticed the headlights of a car driving past, and then about 5 minutes later, he heard a very loud gunshot. Now, by the way, I should say, one of the points that comes out a couple different times in this book is that George is kind of just a great guy, but kind of laid back about his details.
Okay.
So not sure how accurate his estimates are of distance or time.
Okay.
But this is what he's saying. Again, he heard that really loud shot. And then as he started to walk outside towards Henry, who was in the car, he heard a second, much softer shot that he described as sounding almost like it was from a pop gun. And he commented on that second shot to Henry, who said something about it being fearful. And George noticed that because he thought it was funny. Like the first shot was so loud, and here's this one that was kind of like really soft. And he was like, why would he call that fearful? Nettie, the wife, later testified she never even heard the second shot. Now, Verna was not in the car. So George is out here with Henry at the car, and
At the end of his driveway.
yes, parked in his driveway. And I can't recall if George asked where Verna was, to be honest. But what I do know is that not long after, J.B. Hunley comes back, and he has brought with them this man named C.E. Cuba Shaver, who is a LaGrange mechanic.
Okay.
And Henry tells the men, hey, will you go look for Verna? She's gone up the road to get her glove. They left to do that. Well,
These are really nice guys that just seem to do
Aren't
whatever
they?
they're told.
well, and it makes me
Random
wonder,
strangers.
are they really nice guys, or was like Henry
scary.
throwing around his power?
I
Was it
don't
like
know.
he expected to be,
don't
do whatever?
know.
I don't know. But they go, he stays. He doesn't go with them. And they come back saying they didn't see the lady. Okay. So they go ahead and start working on the car, and Henry just stands and watches them calmly. But a couple of times he comments, she was the finest woman I ever knew.
Past tense.
Past tense. Yeah. So when they get the battery fixed, it was J.B. Hundley who said, let's go see about the lady. Now, this time, Henry did follow the two guys as they head off to go look for her. And it was J.B. Hundley who actually saw Verna in the ditch. George Baker had been checking on his wife, so he comes up behind them, but he ends up joining too. Now, as we said earlier, she was laying in that ditch, and she had that bullet hole through her dress right above her left breast. And of course, we talked about how she was positioned. Henry said, ain't that awful, but never went over to her. He did not approach. He didn't go to the ditch. He just reacted to them saying, she's here. Look what's they said what had happened. And his reaction, again, he comments, but he doesn't go to her ever. He just watched from where he was standing on the highway. J.B. Hundley goes to LaGrange for help. George Baker's now a little concerned about his wife. He doesn't want to leave her alone, so he's going to go check on Nettie. And Henry and the mechanic end up just kind of following George Baker, which means they left Verna alone in the ditch.
They don't even know if she's still alive or not, right?
Well, I think they could tell she was.
Okay.
But at the same time,
This poor guy.
This is his fiance.
Yeah.
This is yes.
I'm thinking of Hundley, who's just like, I just was going for a drive, man.
Right.
And I'm in this thing, and I don't.
What have I gotten?
What have I got myself into?
Well, as they're walking, the mechanic notices some keys and a flashlight laying on the side of the road, and Henry says, "Oh yeah, those are mine." And then, not long after, funeral director, a man named Keatley, his last name is Keatley, he arrives. They all ride back out to Verna, and Henry asks if Verna is wearing the engagement ring. He wants to know that, and he also makes a comment about the brothers. He's concerned about how the brothers are going to react. But basically, what everybody remembers is he just kept standing around watching everybody. He never seemed to show any grief, and he never went to look at Verna or, approach her in any way. At one point, Henry commented, I couldn't have killed her. I was too crazy about her. And another important comment that was made that would come back up later in the trial was George Baker said, Mr. Denhardt couldn't have killed that woman because I was with him when that last shot was fired. At some point, this coroner Ricketts, had shown up, and he has to go over, head over to tell Verna's family the tragic news, while Henry is driven home by Cuba Shaver and a friend who's now in the car with him. But the important part is that as Henry is getting out of the vehicle, they notice he has Verna's purse with him, which he zips into his briefcase before he gets out of the vehicle.
That's suspect.
We have a whole lot more to discuss, but why don't we take a break before we do that?
If we must. All right. Season 3 of Scandal Water is finally upon us, and with it, lots of new and exciting opportunities are brewing in the background. We'll keep you posted as each new venture goes live. But in the meantime, we wanted to say thank you to those of you who have shared the podcast, left reviews, and supported us on buymeacoffee.com. You are the reason we are able to keep telling these stories, and we're so, so grateful. So cheers to you, and here's to a fantastic Season 3 with many more fun and peculiar stories about the stage, screen, and everything in between.
And we are back. This case is so fascinating. All right, so here's what happens next. Though the details would end up changing, Henry's story in the beginning is that Verna shot herself because she became increasingly depressed and despondent through the course of the day. The reason being that...
She was with him? Oh, whoop, whoop, whoop.
The reason being that her daughters did not approve of their relationship, and this was upsetting her. Now...
So she's going to kill herself because her daughters don't approve. And that doesn't make any sense.
I think the implication is that she is just so crazy about him and she's afraid that she's not gonna...
Henry wishes. Okay, I'm sorry.
Verna's brothers and different members of the law enforcement team start digging into a few things and immediately begin to question this story of suicide. I can't give you all the details, but I'll hit a few things. The next day, Verna's brother Jack and Sheriff Briggs go back to the site where Verna was found, and they see some heel marks in the ditch, and they also remembered that her shoes were covered in mud. They also notice on the pavement something that looks like blood, so they end up taking up this chunk of pavement and taking it with them for evidence.
That's amazing.
Also, a group of several men, this law enforcement team, they go to talk to Henry the next day. He is drunk. He became belligerent when he could tell that they were kind of questioning his story. They end up having to restrain him and read him the formal summons to an inquest into Verna's death. So he's just acting funny. That is something that came up. He's not acting like this grieving fiance.
Right.
Everything is just kind of weird. All right. Now, they end up bringing in this man to help investigate. His name is Police Sergeant John Mesmer from Louisville, and he was skilled in doing investigations. He agreed to help them for no extra pay. He said, I'm already being paid a salary. I'll help you. But he would end up working for the prosecution team to kind of try to find some evidence. And, you know, it's 1936. He was kind of on the cutting edge a little bit with trying to do, they didn't have forensic. They didn't have the things we have today.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Elliot Ness. You know, he introduced all the forensics and things like that. I'm thinking this is around that same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, this guy was on it. So they end up getting him to, well, he probably was one who suggested it, but he did a paraffin test on Verna's hands while she was laying in state in her home before she was buried to see, you know, if she fired the gun. Right?
There would be evidence.
Right. Now, the test came back negative, but later they would question that test because her hands had been washed after embalming. Another thing that they did was they knew they wanted to get a paraffin test on Henry's hands. So they go over to his house again, and he does agree to the test, which does end up being positive, but, you know, there are always like reasons given, of course. While they're there, one of the investigators happens to say, hey, were you wearing an overcoat the night that you were on this day trip, you know, that all this happened? And he's like, yeah. And they said, do you mind if we take it? He lets them take his coat. In fact, he's like, I just might need somebody else. They were going to like swap out coats. He thinks that it's perfectly fine. As they're leaving, they see what looks like blood on this coat, and they end up showing it to him, and he is shocked. But the other thing they get is, while they're there, they go ahead and get Verna's purse from him, which he admits he had. Okay. So these are some pieces of evidence that their people are gathering, right? At the inquest, Henry was presented with a warrant for his arrest, but he was able to make bail with the help of a close friend who paid the money. Something interesting that happened, though, I'm kind of hitting highlights. Not sure exactly who overheard it, whether it was a Garr brother or maybe it was one of the attorneys, but somehow this team learned or overheard that the defense team was kind of bouncing around the idea of exhuming Verna's body and doing an autopsy, and they decided they were going to do it first without telling the defense team. I'm telling you,
wait, the prosecution?
Yes, The Garr
Exhumed her?
brothers and the prosecution team.
Exhumed her?
I'm telling you, there are so many surprising things in this, fascinating things. The same night of the inquest, in the dark, out there with like lights and things, kind of just using their, I don't know if it was a lantern light or whatever, but they are out in the graveyard. They dig up her body.
What did they want?
They had to go do an autopsy on her.
Oh, to what point? What were they trying to, we know how she passed.
Well, there were all kinds of pieces of evidence they had not yet looked for. So I'll give you a few highlights of what they did find out, okay? But now, just to make this clear, it was breaking protocol because technically the defense team should have had a representative
they
there.
should have, yes.
But these guys did this in secret.
Yeah.
From the beginning, this was obviously very emotional. There was tension, right?
Yeah.
There's tension. So a couple of things the autopsy report did find. They were able to confirm that it was one bullet hole that had entered the front and exited the back, and it gave them the opportunity to look at like angles and trajectory and that type of thing.
Yeah.
They found a bruise on her right inner thigh, which looked recent. Okay. They saw slight discoloration around the front bullet wound, which would end up leading to some controversy because remember, they're trying to figure out, was it her?
Yeah.
Which would have been up close, or is this somebody from a further distance who had made the shot, right? And they even took pieces of skin from around the wound sites that they sent off to a U of L pathologist professor guy to look at. So these are some of the things that they looked at. They also, I can't remember if it was during the autopsy or if it was when they first brought Verna in, but they had noticed it was unusual that her slip, she had a tear in it. Everything else was just kind of immaculate. She was so well put together. And so it struck them as odd that she would have this tear in her slip. So some things like this are coming to light, making people wonder things.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the examining trial was held about 2 weeks after Verna's death.
That is fast.
It is fast. And it was at the Newcastle Courthouse in Henry County. The place was packed. And just to be clear, sentiment is very much against Henry Denhardt. In fact, at one point, one of the team members from the prosecution, his name was Jimmy Thomas, he was very dramatic and very fiery, and he made a comment that in his experience, the only man charged with murder who didn't go to jail was Henry Denhardt. The crowd broke out into such loud cheering and applause that they had to be admonished by the judge. Whoa. I mean, this was a very, very
beloved woman.
And
he was definitely an outsider.
Exactly. And it did not look good. Now, on a related side note that I just found interesting, Anne shared so many fascinating details through the course of her book, Dark Highway, but even Henry's lawyers struggled sometimes with Henry.
He was not likable.
He wouldn't pay his lawyers. He haggled with them. They had done so much work for him, and he wouldn't be paying them. They had to fight him to get their money. Sometimes they had to fight against him because he wanted to control everything. He wanted to tell them what to say, or here's what we're going to do. They had to watch him because he kept trying to talk. He would make these self-serving comments that weren't helping him.
No.
So they were trying to get him to keep his mouth quiet. And this is just an interesting, I think, side note. One of those lawyers, who was a very close friend of his, who actually very much believed in his innocence, was John Marshall Berry from Newcastle, who is the father of
Wendell Berry.
Yes. I thought that was fascinating.
That is, yes. And there's a tie with his son, John Berry Jr., who is now passed, but we used his law office for the Hepburn Girls. Yes, we used his upstairs law office in downtown Newcastle when we were, scouting locations and everything. We used his office for one of the scenes.
Very cool.
Yeah, he was a very nice guy.
Oh, I love that. After the examining trial, Henry was again released on bond, again paid by a friend, until the grand jury trial would be heard in January, at which point he was charged with the crime of willful murder. Okay. So then that means the next step is the actual trial.
Okay.
Well, as luck would have it, this is just the craziest stuff. The Great Flood happens. And so his trial ends up being delayed because everybody's affected by the flood.
The flood.
It is craziness. Well, this is a comment that Anne made, which I thought was very true and insightful. She commented that she felt the delay really helped the defense team more than the prosecution. Remember, the prosecution had everything going for them, including a lot of
emotion.
Yes, a
public
lot of emotion,
sentiment.
Public sentiment. But this defense team had some sharp people on it. She called them the dream team at one point. By the way, somewhere around in here, I believe Henry found time to go on vacation to Florida.
Whatever, Henry.
Right. And also sometime before the trial, Henry found time to write or dictate a 3-page memorandum telling his side of the story, and it contained a lot of statements that Anne described as, quote, self-serving and self-aggrandizing. Now, we're going to ask Anne to tell us more about this document because I think it was kind of a big deal. But just to briefly share this, Henry really painted an unflattering picture of Verna as he's trying to tell his side of the story, accusing her of being very jealous, talks about how she's just so into him that, that's part of why she's so despondent and suicidal. And he also makes these accusations or at least hints that she'd had a love affair with Chester Woolfolk, which he does straight up say she revealed to him on the day trip, and that's what made him feel so upset and so sick, and also why she becomes so despondent. At different times, we
call that projection, kids. That's a term we call projection.
I don't even know if I have a term for it.
Okay.
But at different times, in some versions, she suggested that they go get married right then that day and was upset because he didn't want to. He definitely said in this document that she had suggested they make a suicide pact.
Oh, no.
And at one point she asked him, she was suicidal. She asked him to help her write a legally correct suicide note. So many things. So many things. And also somewhere in there, his explanation for the blood on the coat came out. It was because he had this cut on his finger that was bleeding.
Okay.
All right. Now, the trial was held at the Henry County Courthouse. The judge did not change the venue as the defense team wanted to happen.
That was probably not smart, but yeah.
Well, and again, read the book, but it's crazy how Anne described it as being like a circus, and it sounded like it was.
That's what, it's not good for the defense.
Yeah.
To not change the venue.
Well, some key things, just a few highlights. The prosecution was really honed in on trying to show that Verna was not in a depressed state.
Right.
And they also used their forensic attempts to prove their case. For example, in addition to the paraffin, one of the other things that they did was this Sergeant Messmer and some doctors and that pathologist, they had taken a pig to a rifle range. The pig had its blood drained from it. It had been washed, and they draped pieces of Verna's slip and her dress over the pig, and then they shot it from lots of different distances so they could measure and make observational notes about I know it's sad, but
they're trying.
Yeah. They also used a sparkograph machine that measured gas emitted from a gun when it was shot. They were really trying to use hard evidence to show that Verna could not have killed herself. And they also tried to introduce this fountain pen gun that the general carried as a possible source for that second shot that was heard by George Baker. Now, one other thing they brought out was that bruise on Verna's inner thigh and the tear in her slip.
Yeah.
Okay. The defense team, some of their key strategies were hinting that something might be up with Chester Woolfolk.
Oh.
And they didn't come right out, but there were hints. They were kind of planting some ideas. They really went after Mr. Mesmer's forensics, his competence. They tried to discredit him, anything he'd done, like his paraffin test. They were trying to say that they were not valid. They brought in their own experts who had done a similar test to the one that the other guys had done with the pig, and they had different results, obviously. They had witnesses who said Henry had really cut his finger. He was a bleeder, and, it had to be treated by a doctor. They also said, even the way the blood was on the coat wouldn't even look consistent with how the blood would look if he had either dragged Verna's body after she was wounded, or the way her wound had occurred. Like, that's not how the blood would have been expressed to come out on somebody's coat. So they're basically trying to address all these other points. Interestingly, the defense also put Henry on the stand. So
why in the world?
Well, I'm sure he wanted to be, but they also let him tell a lot of his version of what happened, of course. And of course, this is where he had the chance to explain the timeline for the day, which is how we knew some of those things, such as what he supposedly did during that window of time.
Right.
And again, he did not outright accuse Verna of having an affair with Chester, but during this trial, He did mention that she had offered to give the ring back to him, but he had said no, and that she had admitted that Chester was in love with her and was jealous of her relationship with Henry. And this supposedly now, rather than the daughters, remember this first version was the daughters were upset. Now she's despondent because Chester has confessed his love and he's so jealous of her relationship with Henry, and it's just causing this angst. And that's why she was suicidal in this version.
Also sounds like projection.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Well, to kind of wrap this trial part up, in Dark Highway, here's a quote from Anne's book where she talks about how the prosecutor H.B. Kinsolving ended his closing statement. He scoffed at the idea that Verna committed suicide and told the jury that the only thing to support it was the general's own statement. Quote, he admits she offered to give his ring back that day. I tell you, he killed her in anger when she told him she was going to break off with him. End quote. So that's Kinsolving's take on that.
Gotcha.
And I just wanted to share that. Now, here's the interesting part.
It's all been interesting. There's more.
You would have thought that this trial would have ended with Henry being convicted of murder.
Yeah.
The jury was deadlocked.
I am flabbergasted.
Yeah. Yeah. And they were too. And I think it speaks to the strength of the defense team.
Yes.
They were the dream team.
Yes.
They were amazing. Henry thought this was a huge victory because public opinion was so strongly against him. So he felt like a second trial, he's going to get off.
Yeah.
If their team could get a deadlock from the first trial, by the time a second one rolls around, he's going to
get off.
Really good chance to get off.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what happened next. Now they're waiting for the new trial. In the meantime, this is fascinating. The general is charged with the murder of another woman named Patricia Wilson. Okay, I am holding off because I want to hear Anne tell us about this,
yes.
but I'm going to give you just this really tiny short version. This alleged murder by Henry would have occurred before he met Verna.
Okay.
The accusation, which was filed by the sister of the woman, Patricia Wilson's sister, was that on the night of July 14th or the early hours of July 15th, 1936, Henry Denhardt assaulted and beat Patricia Wilson, causing her to fall into an elevator shaft at the Seelbach Hotel and die.
Oh my gosh.
The petition requested $75,000 for what they labeled a wrongful death action. Now, the implication was...
This is about a month after he's met her, right? He met her in June.
That is so true.
Yeah, and this would be while she's gone.
That's right.
Yeah.
That is so right. I hadn't put the timeline together. That is so true. The implication, this might have been from the people involved in the situation. I think they were trying to portray Patricia as kind of a party girl who was at the Seelbach because these prominent wealthy men were there and she was like socializing with them. But if you've ever heard the legend of the Lady in Blue from the Seelbach Hotel,
I have not.
This is her.
This is her? I have not heard
We're
that.
going to ask Anne so much more about this. Okay. But the general denies any involvement, but he's furious about this because remember, he's still heading into another trial for the murder of Verna.
Right.
And
He doesn't
now this
want
comes out. So he says he was on his farm that night that Patricia died, but he's outraged. He does file a countersuit because he's so mad and he wants to make a statement. And he blames his political opponents and the Garr brothers and their lawyers for conspiring against him. He thinks all of this lawsuit is because they're trying to hurt his good name and set him up to
Everybody's
lose
against
this
me.
next case, right? Now, again, so think about how the brothers are feeling.
Right.
I mean, the feelings, fear, the tension between these people is just monumental. They despise each other. So they're heading into the second trial, and on top of the really negative feelings between the two sides, there's other things that are fueling it. There's a rumor out there that Henry's defense team may be bringing in some new evidence that's going to make Verna look bad.
Oh.
Now, we don't know whether that would be making accusations about a relationship with Chester Wolfe or saying something about, them having a relationship and using that hotel. Who knows?
Right.
But the rumor is that something negative might be brought in about Verna. That's obviously not going to go over well.
No, but shouldn't the prosecution find out about it in discovery? Wouldn't they be told?
They did know. This is something that Anne mentioned in the book, is that Henry had sent a letter. Now, I don't know if they knew this, but we know that Henry had sent a letter to John Barry asking him to subpoena some laundry employees.
Oh, so he's wanting to subpoena Chester, I bet.
It might have been Chester, is what we suspect now. I don't know that the brothers would have known that back then. So on September 20th, the night before the second trial was to start, Henry met with his lawyers in Shelbyville at the Armstrong Hotel to prepare.
Yes.
Now, this meeting was very widely known because different members had mentioned it. Some of the lawyers had even mentioned it to reporters. So this was something that was out there. Now, this is interesting. On the prosecution side, Detective Mesmer had proposed sending someone with a dictaphone to try to eavesdrop on the defense meeting.
Guys.
I know. He checked in with Kinsolving about it, the prosecutor, and Prosecutor Kinsolving was like, but he didn't tell Mesmer to stop. So he actually sent this guy named George Blades over, and he rented a room right beside Henry Denhardt's room in the Armstrong Hotel, and he set up his equipment, but reportedly missed the meeting. Okay.
What?
Now, the defense team had their dinner at the hotel. They were in the hotel dining room. And then they did have their conference in the hotel room. And after this is all over, two of the attorneys leave. And Rhodes Myers and Henry Denhardt decide that they're going to walk to a nearby restaurant to get a beer.
Okay.
All right. Meanwhile, over here with the Garr brothers, Roy had picked up his two brothers and they were going to go visit Prosecutor Kinsolving. Again, it's the night before the trial.
Sure.
Just to check in. Are
Yeah.
all of our ducks in a row?
Yeah.
So actually, Roy's the only one who went in to talk to the prosecutor. He was kind of always the leader.
Okay.
And
Is he the oldest?
Well, the oldest was Doc, but Doc had basically, they think it was something like PTSD from
Okay.
the war, and he had had some mental issues, mental
Okay.
health issues, and Jack was the youngest, so Roy was kind of the leader.
Okay.
So Roy goes in and he talks to the lawyer for like 30 minutes while his brothers wait in the car, and then the three of them decided they were going to go visit their friend Ryan Blakemore, who also actually happened to be related to them through Verna's marriage, and Ryan Blakemore had a grocery called the Blakemore Grocery, which happened to be located next to the Armstrong Hotel in Shelbyville.
Okay.
So the brothers are now in Shelbyville and they go into the grocery, chat with, how there are men sitting around
Yeah.
talking in the
Yeah.
grocery all the time. So they chat with a little group of men. Ryan comes in, they chat with him, and then they leave. But after they'd already left, Roy said, oops, I never asked Ryan if he's coming to the trial tomorrow. I want to go back and check in with him. So they come back around, they park on a side street, and Jack waits in the car while Roy and Doc head to go back into the Blakemore grocery. Just so happens that this is the same time that General Denhardt, Henry, and Rhodes Myers are returning from their beer.
Yeah.
So they're coming towards the hotel, and about the time they reach the middle of Main Street, these brothers have been coming around from the side, and they're also heading towards the building that's right there by the hotel.
Yeah.
And suddenly Rhodes Myers yells, "There are the Garr brothers." Now remember, both parties are terrified of each other.
Yeah.
On the one hand, Henry is known for having this huge collection of firearms. He's always, everybody thinks he's always
Armed and ready.
and ready to go. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, the brothers, at least two of them, carry firearms frequently, and the tension is high. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of hatred here. When the general heard Rhodes Myers yell that, he immediately panicked. He starts running, zigzagging.
Which is what you're supposed to do.
Right, towards the hotel entrance, which in effect...
It's toward them.
Yes, that is exactly right. Now, Roy would later say, quote, "He come right quartering towards me. I looked up and the first thing I saw was Denhardt. The next thing I saw, going for his right hip pocket, and by God, I went for mine pretty fast, and when I got my gun, I shot twice. I was scared and I saw him and it scared me. I saw that dead sister of mine. When I saw him, I went to shooting. I emptied my gun before I quit shooting."
Wow.
Now, Doc was also shooting, okay?
Yeah.
Doc, he, of course, also later said that he saw Denhardt make a motion like he was preparing to draw a gun. So
Yeah.
he had started shooting too.
Yeah.
Both of them were firing at Henry as Henry is staggering, trying to get through that front door of the
Yeah.
hotel.
Yeah.
Well, Rhodes Myers had started to run away, but he stopped when he saw Henry collapse in front of the hotel, basically in the doorway. And his testimony would be that in terms of himself, he saw Doc aiming a gun at him and he started begging Doc not to shoot him. Reportedly, he said, "Don't shoot me. I'm just the lawyer." And Doc made some kind of comment about how, Myers had defended the man who killed his sister. But Roy came over, grabbed Doc's arm, and he did not shoot Rhodes Myers. So he lived to tell the story. Okay. Now, the Garrs headed off to turn themselves in. Harry Flood owned the hotel. He was the first one to reach Henry. So he had some testimony. There happened to be some other people who were around who would give testimony too. We'll come back to them in a second.
Okay.
George Blades did still have his dictaphone running when the shots happened. Okay. Henry was shot twice in the back and once in the back of his skull. And that's important. The shots were from the back.
Right.
Okay. By the way, he also had a letter from his ex-wife in his pocket. Now, here's what happened. The brothers were treated like folk heroes.
I bet.
Everybody was on their side.
Yeah.
In jail, people sent some food. Everybody wanted to interview them and take their pictures. And a strong team.
I would just say it would be two of the three brothers, right? The third one was still in the car, supposedly?
Well, at first, all three of them were taken in.
Okay.
But you make an excellent point, and we're going to come back to that.
Okay.
Okay. A strong team stepped up to defend them, and the prosecutor, who had been on their side in the case, where their sister's involved, he's supposed to be up now to prosecute them because he's the prosecutor.
Oh.
And he was like, I can't do this. So they brought in another guy from an outside guy that they referred to as the foreigner, because he wasn't a local.
Yeah.
But Hubert Meredith agreed to step in. And he's thinking this Hubert Meredith guy, from the beginning, his assumption was the Garr brothers had ambushed Denhardt. Okay. At the examining trial, which was at the Shelby County Courthouse, they heard it all, but they did let the brothers go home for a week on bond until the grand jury met, because obviously there was evidence that they may have committed murder.
Right.
So then they came back for the grand jury, meeting, and that's when they were given an indictment for willful murder. And this was against all three brothers, but it was almost deadlocked. Like, they had to push for them to actually make a decision because the public was for
so
these
much
Garr
on their
brothers.
side.
Yes. So they were released on bond again until the trial, which occurred within a month.
This is fast justice back then.
It really was. Now, in the meanwhile, Doc, who again had all these, mental health issues and even some physical issues that he had been dealing with, he had a breakdown. He had to be taken under doctor's care. So from this point on, he basically drops out of this. Like, now we've got Jack and Roy who are going in to face this trial.
Okay.
Now, the basic argument is, did the brothers ambush Henry Denhardt and cold-bloodedly murder him, or was it really a chance meeting and self-defense,
Right.
which is what they're claiming?
Right.
Okay. Now, the prosecution is relying on testimony from different people, but a key one is Rhodes Myers, because what Rhodes Myers said is that a lot of the gunshots happened like, bam, 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 but then there's a long pause, and then Roy, he says, walked up to Henry and fired the kill shot right into Henry's head. Now, Roy, of course, remember, he's saying he was
I saw him go for
self-defense. Yep. So
They both reached for the gun.
Chicago reference. So to support Roy's claim that he thought Henry was getting ready to draw a gun, there was another patrolman who had happened to kind of come upon the scene as it was playing out, and he testified that Henry Denhardt had a handkerchief in his right hand when he was laying in the doorway.
So he had gone for a handkerchief?
Well, Rhodes Myers had said he did not have a handkerchief as they were coming back from the beer. So maybe the idea is maybe at some point he pulled, I don't know why you would pull out a handkerchief, but he had pulled this handkerchief, and that's why the brothers thought he was getting ready to shoot them. Also, witness accounts did not bear up the story that Rhodes Myers had told about there being kind of this pause in the gunshots before the final shot was made. They just didn't hear that. In fact, they also had the son of the owner had been working the front desk at the hotel, so he was kind of there right in the doorway, and he said he did not see anybody approach Henry's body after he fell. The other interesting thing that happened during this trial was that people openly, I guess the right word might be, condemned Henry's character. Two of Verna's employees testified about overhearing him make angry comments and threats related to Verna's brothers and even her girls. There was a friend he knew through the military. Well, I don't know if he was a friend, but someone he knew through the military named Brigadier General Carter, who said, quote, "I knew him as one of the most violent, unscrupulous, domineering domineering and brutal men I've ever known in my life.
Wow.
Other officers spoke openly about how overbearing he was and how he always carried a gun. So people, now that he was gone,
They were telling what they really thought about him.
they were very openly disparaging him.
Wow.
Absolutely. And to follow up on this, and another interesting side note is this trial was so sensational and the brothers so popular that D.W. Griffith came one day with his young wife. And just to follow that out, he actually for a time lived on the same street as Verna. He was from that area for a while.
Wow.
Yeah. So the jury took about an hour and 15 minutes and one ballot before they reached their verdict. You want to guess what it was?
I'm going to say not guilty.
Not guilty.
Yeah.
And this occurred 15 days short of the first anniversary of Verna's death.
Wow.
Yeah. So I didn't mention this, but before the verdict had come down, they had already dismissed Jack from it because he
was in the car.
And he wasn't even armed.
Okay.
Like, he didn't even have a gun with him that day.
Okay.
So, but he stayed by his brother's side.
Good.
He said, I want to stay and follow this out. So he stayed by Roy's side until the verdict was read. Now, afterwards, in 1938, Doc's charges were also dismissed. His mental and physical health had just continued to decline. So, and they knew they weren't going to convict him if his brother had gotten off.
Right.
So they let it go. But he caused a stir when in December of that same year, he proposed a new theory about Verna's death that did not align with just Henry killed her. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you any more than that because that'll be another interesting thing that we can talk to Anne about. I will say this as well, if we're going to talk teasers, one of my very favorite parts of the book is when we get to the end, and Anne is so good about just presenting just fascinating, engaging details, well researched, and then at the end she weighs in and tells you
her opinion,
what she thinks.
Interesting.
Because I mean, honestly, Verna's case just got dropped. I mean, in effect, it was never
never solved.
It was never solved. She tells you how she thinks it might have gone down.
Interesting.
I can't wait to talk to her about that. I have a question I want to ask her because as I was reading it, there was something that just was burning a hole in me. I was like, what about this? But what about this? So we've got so many things to talk to Anne about in our interview. Cannot wait. It's going to be so fun. For our armchair, we're not going to weigh in right now because we're going to save that. But I will ask, do you have any questions or anything that you are looking forward to talking with Anne about?
I want to analyze his at the scene behavior. I want to talk about that. And something else, I don't know, we said we're not going to weigh in, but I wrote down while you were talking, hired killer, ? Because that could be the reason for the second shot. That could be the reason why he wasn't worried about anything because he didn't really do it, but he knew who did. And he seems so cold and calculating that could the car that drove by that they saw headlights and then he's up there with this guy and then they hear this second shot. I don't know. That's just what I wanted to talk about.
I will say the accomplice theory is one of the many that was brought up. So, yes. All right, Ashley. Well, I guess that brings us to our cheers.
Yes.
I think it's obvious. Okay, it's obvious I want to give a big shout out to Anne D'Angelo because her work is just fascinating and kudos to her for taking that time and that integrity to do such a great job with this. But also Verna. Yeah. I just loved her in this book, and it was just so tragic and so unfair to her on so many levels. Yeah. So how about a cheers to two strong women?
That's right.
Anne D'Angelo and Verna Garr Taylor.
Cheers.
If you love what we do, please rate and review our show. Or you can become a supporter by making a donation through buymeacoffee.com/scandalwaterpod. Whether a single gift or a recurring monthly donation, it would go a long way towards supporting our work and allowing us to keep the tea brewing.
At our website, www.scandalwaterpodcast.com, you can submit questions or your own story ideas, access our sources and show notes, see the merch we offer for sale, and more. You can join the Scandal Water community through our Scandal Water Podcast Facebook page or follow us on Instagram or TikTok at Scandal Water Podcast.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown,
that's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music. Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.